When she was 22 years old, Rosemary Kennedy's powerful father forced her to have a lobotomy, citing her supposed intellectual disabilities. But new evidence has revealed the even darker truth. As a sister of John F. Kennedy and the eldest daughter of the formidable and famous Kennedy clan, Rosemary Kennedy should have been American royalty, like so many of her siblings. Instead, she was the family's dirty little secret, and her horrific fate casts a dark pallor on the vaunted American dynasty. On September 13th, 1918, Rosemary Kennedy was born into an America in the middle of fighting World War I. Rosemary's family life, however, was a far cry from the blood and toil of the battlefield. Her parents, Joseph and Rose Kennedy, were powerful movers and shakers in the political world, and eagerly awaited the birth of their first daughter and third child. Until it all went so wrong. One of the other world events going on at the time of Rosemary's birth was the vicious epidemic of the Spanish flu, which was killing people in massive numbers in nearly every continent. Because of the demands of the flu on doctors, the evening that Rosemary's mother went into labor, there was no physician available to see her through the birth. Frantic, the attending nurse demanded that Rose Kennedy hold her legs closed while in full labor to prevent the baby being born before the doctor arrived. Little Rosemary's head sat in the birth canal for over 2 agonizing hours, cutting her off from precious oxygen. Still, the newborn came home, and the Kennedys may have hoped it was all going to be okay from then on. As you might expect from the family that would go on to groom not just President John F. Kennedy, but also 2 senators in Robert and Ted, the Kennedy elders were demanding parents who expected their children to be proper, traditional, and near perfect. So imagine their horror when little Rosemary began failing to meet regular childhood development milestones, having difficulty crawling even at 2 years old. Obsessed with presenting a pristine image, the Kennedys made a cruel choice. Instead of openly seeking help for Rosemary, they all but tried to hide her disability from the world, with Rose Kennedy confiding to almost no one about her little girl's difficulties and pretending that everything was proceeding normally with her development. Yet, as time went on, the issues only became more and more obvious. Rose would eventually give birth to a total of 9 children, and soon their dinner tables were full of hungry teenagers and the classic quick Kennedy banter. Yet, in these get-togethers, Rosemary was markedly different, seeming baffled by the repartee and remaining serenely quiet. Indeed, Rosemary's whole personality was much sweeter than that of her siblings. Her mother once said, "She was so willing to try to do her best, so appreciative of attention and compliments, and so hopeful of deserving them." One of Rosemary's other qualities, however, was throwing her parents into a panic. By the time Rosemary was a preteen, it was very obvious that while she may not have inherited the Kennedy gift of the gab, she did inherit their upper-class Irish good looks. Her older brothers, particularly her next eldest brother John, had to fend off suitors who were trying to get close to the naive, beautiful girl. Even so, the Kennedys were trying to make Rosemary presentable. Throughout these years, they had tried everything they could think of to turn Rosemary into a debutante, with no whiff of imperfections, like a disability. First, they used private tutors, who still struggled to teach her to read and write, but when she was 15, and just growing into her beauty, her parents shipped her off to a convent. Although Rosemary had attended boarding schools before, her time at the Sacred Heart Convent in Rhode Island was something else entirely. For one, it must have been an incredibly isolating experience. Her parents made sure the nuns educated her completely separately from the other students. Of course, they probably hoped the one-on-one attention would benefit their daughter more than a full classroom, but this scenario also surely kept Rosemary's troubles hush-hush, too. It wasn't the only way they tried to keep it secret. While Rosemary was at Sacred Heart Convent, her parents were still wheeling and dealing in high society, and her brother John was as promising a young man as they could have hoped. Seeking to put both siblings out more into society, Rose arranged for John to accompany Rosemary to a tea dance around this time, and Rose and Joseph Kennedy were overjoyed afterward when one of the crowing compliments Rosemary got was that she was not different at all, as long as John was on her arm and leading her through the dances, that is. The Kennedys could simply not accept their daughter for herself, whatever that might have looked like. It was a dark tendency, and it would get much darker. In 1938, the patriarch Joseph Kennedy had just become the American ambassador to the United Kingdom, and the Kennedy family were fully hitting their stride when it came to social influence. Rose and Joseph decided Rosemary would come out as a debutante to none other than King George VI of the United Kingdom and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. But one of the biggest hurdles for Rosemary, who could still only read and write at around a 4th grade level, were the rigors of royal manners. In particular, palace etiquette demanded that when her parents presented her to the king and queen, she had to go through a full and very complex royal curtsy. Rosemary practiced for hours to get it right, but when the day came, it fell apart. Nervous and knowing her parents would accept nothing less than perfection, Rosemary walked into the event, went up to do her curtsy, and almost tripped right over herself. She barely avoided falling right in front of the monarchs, who politely pretended not to notice and stood there with fixed smiles on their faces. In true Kennedy fashion, Rose Kennedy somehow managed to look at that near disaster and see only what she wanted to see. She never mentioned that Rosemary had nearly fallen or otherwise discussed the snag in any way. In fact, she treated Rosemary's embarrassing debut as nothing short of a triumph to anyone who asked. The Kennedys had wanted to present Rosemary as a beautiful debutante, and they certainly got the world's attention. But with this attention came unwanted questions. Society magazines now wanted to write Rosemary up in their pages, yet both Rose and Joseph Kennedy thought that any interview their daughter gave would give away her disabilities. So while the family did allow some interviews for Rosemary, Rose and Joseph controlled most of the information that got out to the press themselves. They told Woman's Day that Rosemary was studying to be a kindergarten teacher, while the publication Parents got the more whimsical response that she is said to harbor a secret longing to go on the stage. Around the time of these puff pieces, the Boston Globe asked for an interview with Rosemary. Joseph Kennedy actually had his assistant write out a response from Rosemary that read, "I have always had serious tastes and understand life is not given to us just for enjoyment. For some time past, I've been studying the well-known psychological method of Dr. Maria Montessori, and I got my degree in teaching last year." He then had Rosemary herself painstakingly copy out those words in her own writing. By 1940, Rosemary was on top of the world, at least in the public eye where no one had access to her private life. But when she came back from her triumphant debut in England, something seemed to snap. According to Rosemary's younger sister Eunice, the 22-year-old Rosemary's mental and emotional abilities seemed to regress almost overnight. And then the real trouble started. As Rosemary turned into a woman, she began developing terrifying symptoms. Reportedly, she started having seizures, or at the very least some kind of convulsions, that confused and scared her family and often left her incapacitated. Although Rosemary's seizures were alarming in their own right, it seemed her entire personality began to change as her mental faculties degraded, and not for the better. Soon, at least according to her family, she was prone to vicious outbursts and rages over the smallest of things, often even physically attacking family members. Fed up with Rosemary's erratic and unpredictable behavior, the Kennedy clan sent her to a summer camp in Massachusetts in the hopes that it would all blow over. It was doomed from the start. Not only was Rosemary expelled for her continued antics, but a successive stint in a Philadelphia boarding school lasted only a few months. At the end of their ropes, Joseph and Rose Kennedy shipped off Rosemary to yet another convent school, much like the one she'd spent her teenage years in. But this time, things were very different. Rosemary was an adult who had tasted independence, and she wasn't about to let more nuns tell her how to live her life. Instead of sitting around at the convent and perfecting her prayers, Rosemary began regularly sneaking out of the convent at night, much to the horror of the nuns and her own parents. But given what they suspected she was doing on these nights off, they had a right to worry. Although they couldn't prove exactly why Rosemary was sneaking out of the convent, the nuns believed she was meeting men back in town and very possibly even sleeping with them, opening her up to the scandalous possibility of falling pregnant. While Rosemary was going through this obvious crisis, her family's response, particularly that of her father, was fundamentally selfish. Joseph Kennedy was even more sure that his eldest daughter was inevitably going to embarrass him and ruin her brother's chances at brilliant political careers, not to mention her sister's social opportunities. It led him to an absolutely horrific act. Mental illness was little understood at the time, but there was a chilling new solution: a lobotomy. The procedure was meant to calm agitated patients, with utterly disturbing methods. In the surgery, doctors cut off the neural connectors in the frontal lobe, with the intention of almost biologically sedating difficult patients. When Joseph Kennedy heard about the procedure, he thought it was the perfect thing for Rosemary. So in November 1941, when Rosemary was 23 years old, she underwent a lobotomy procedure with Dr. James Watts and Dr. Walter Freeman. As they worked, they had Rosemary recite the Lord's Prayer or sing God Bless America or count backward to see how far they needed to cut. They only stopped when she grew nonsensical. The gruesome job done, they sent Rosemary home to recover. It didn't take long to realize that the surgery had done far more damage than good. Rosemary had gone into the lobotomy suffering from occasional, if unpredictable, fits of anger. As the days passed and she was supposed to be getting better, it became clear she was actually much worse. The doctors had cut too far, and she could now barely speak at all, at least with any intelligible speech. Her mental capacity plummeted to that of a toddler, and she lost the ability to walk and to go to the bathroom independently. To top it all off, Joseph hadn't even told his wife Rose that he was planning to lobotomize their eldest daughter until after the procedure. Joseph and Rose whisked Rosemary off to an institution, first in New York State and then in Wisconsin at the St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children. While there, the Kennedys did everything they could to isolate her from prying eyes, building her own campus residence that people nicknamed the Kennedy Cottage. The Kennedys had always been obsessed with secrecy, but Joseph Kennedy took it to an entirely new level when it came to Rosemary. He reportedly kept her lobotomy, subsequent condition, and her location a secret even from her own brothers and sisters. Instead, the family line was that she was a recluse. As such, Rosemary lived a completely separate life from her family at St. Coletta's. Her pleasures were meager and simple. 2 nuns took care of most of her needs, as she could no longer even be semi-independent. They sometimes allowed her to sit in a car for a drive, take a dog for a walk, or do some pottery under teacher supervision. Throughout this time, there are scant records of Rosemary's parents, Joseph or Rose, ever visiting her at St. Coletta, at least with any regularity. Rose Kennedy certainly didn't visit her daughter for over 20 years, and most of the siblings didn't know enough about her fate to visit either. This lonely life continued for decades, until it reached a breaking point. In 1961, Joseph Kennedy got everything he'd ever wanted when he watched his son John F. Kennedy campaign for and then become President of the United States. Feeling it was finally safe, it was only then that the patriarch revealed to the public that his daughter Rosemary had been institutionalized for her mental issues. But he left out the fact that he had lobotomized her, which only came out in 1987. In a twist of fate, Joseph Kennedy suffered a massive stroke the same year that John F. Kennedy became president, and, like Rosemary, his mental faculties were now much diminished, and he had difficulty walking. It was then that he finally let his other children in on where their oldest sister was living. But it would take a greater tragedy for them to see her again. It took 8 long years for Joseph Kennedy to finally fade away, and the patriarch of the Kennedy clan passed in 1969, having lived through his son John's assassination. It was only then that the spell broke enough for the surviving Kennedy children to begin visiting Rosemary at St. Coletta's. And when they got there, they must have been shocked at what they saw. Despite the horrific treatment her family had put her through, Rosemary was a fighter, and she had undergone a stunning transformation. Over the years, she had worked immensely hard to be able to walk again, though she still walked with a limp. And while her speech was never truly recovered and her arm was palsied, she was able to find ways to communicate. Yet there were darker legacies to deal with. To this day, unsettling rumors still follow the story of Rosemary Kennedy. Namely, because the Kennedys were so secretive about her, experts still struggle to understand the nature of her mental capacities and disabilities. Indeed, some believe Rosemary wasn't even mentally disabled at all. According to one interpretation of Rosemary's life, she suffered from mental illness, quite possibly depression, rather than a mental disability, though tragically it was likely all the same to her ambitious parents. There is some damning proof for this interpretation. Even one of the doctors who performed Rosemary's lobotomy, James Watts, later confessed that he didn't think she had a mental disability. Watts himself subscribed to the idea that Rosemary suffered from depression, which, in fairness, was still sometimes treated with lobotomies in the 1940s. But it's Rosemary's own diaries and words that reveal the most disturbing truth. Before her lobotomy, Rosemary wrote copiously in her diaries, and her recollections indicate a relatively normal life full of social events in high society. Just a year before the procedure, in fact, she wrote to her father saying, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you, and I love you so much." Though these messages can't prove her mental capacity, they certainly don't indicate violence in her behavior. Perhaps, then, Rosemary's worst sin was simply being different than the rest of her family. There is one silver lining to Rosemary's experiences. In the 1960s, Rosemary's sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Special Olympics. Shriver stated that many people and their stories inspired her to start the Games, but that Rosemary was one of the kinds of people who she wanted to see more in sports. Rosemary suffered through a much worse kind of Kennedy curse than any of her family, but she did manage to outlive many of them. Infamously, her two eldest brothers, Joseph Jr. and John Kennedy, died violently, as did her younger sister Kathleen and her younger brother Bobby. Meanwhile, Rosemary's simple, quiet life went on until 2005. On January 7, 2005, Rosemary Kennedy passed from natural causes at the age of 86, surrounded by her surviving siblings. At the time, she was still living in Wisconsin, where she spent her years after the lobotomy. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.